A diver discovered an old armored truck at the bottom of a lake. What he found inside shocked everyone. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. Michael Johnson had always felt more at home beneath the surface of the water than above it. On land, the world was loud, filled with impatient voices and clattering engines and people who rushed through life without ever stopping to notice the quiet things. Underwater, however, everything paused. Movement slowed, sounds softened, and the water wrapped around him like a calm whisper, reminding him to breathe, to feel, to be present. That was why Miller Lake had become not just a place he visited, but the pulse of his everyday life. He lived alone in a modest house just a short walk from the shoreline. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, paint faded by sun and rain, a roof he always promised himself to repair by next season, but it was his sanctuary. The porch was cluttered with drying wetsuits and tangled ropes, and a large toolbox sat open by the steps, filled with spare filters, flashlight parts, and rusted pieces he kept meaning to toss. A bicycle leaned against the wall, its tires caked with mud from his daily trips to and from the water. It was the home of a man who spent more time in the lake than anywhere else. Inside, the rooms were sparse, but small framed photographs took up one shelf. His mother smiling proudly at a high school graduation ceremony, his younger brother sitting on a rock by the lake holding a fishing rod too big for his hands, and in the center, a picture of Michael as a teenager, hair longer, grin bright, arm wrapped around a boy his age. The photo captured a friendship that would never grow into adulthood. Most of the town barely remembered the incident anymore. A summer afternoon, kids daring each other to swim farther and farther from shore, laughter echoing in the warm air. But one wrong step on a slippery rock, one moment of panic beneath the surface, and everything changed. Michael had been right there when his closest friend, Tyrone, disappeared beneath the dark water. He had screamed for help, dove after him again and again, but the visibility was terrible, and the panic made every second feel like hours. By the time adults came running, it was too late. Tyrone was pulled out lifeless, and Michael had never been able to forgive himself for being unable to save him. From that day on, water became something he could not walk away from. He needed to understand it, master it. He needed to make sure no one else suffered the same fate. Many people, after trauma, avoided what hurt them. Michael did the opposite. He confronted it every single day. He taught himself to dive, to move effortlessly underwater like a creature born there. Over time, he became a certified diver and volunteered to help the fire department with underwater searches whenever needed. Yet, his main passion remained the same: cleaning Miller Lake. Some called it pointless, others called it noble. For Michael, it was neither. It was necessary. Every broken bottle he removed, every jagged piece of metal he hauled up, felt like a small apology to Tyrone, whispered into the depths. He treated the lake like a living being that deserved care and respect, even when others didn't see it that way. The townspeople in Kingston Falls had mixed opinions about him. Children admired him and sometimes watched with fascination as he pulled up old bicycles, rusted tools, or toys lost years ago. Elderly residents nodded to him respectfully, thinking of the lake as part of the town's heritage and appreciating his work. But others whispered that he was an oddball who must have too much free time if he spent his days swimming through muck and weeds. Store clerks smiled politely when he walked in, but their conversations resumed the moment he left, usually beginning with the phrase, "There goes that diver again." Even the sheriff's office, while occasionally grateful for his help, mostly regarded him as someone who sought excitement in ways that officials didn't quite trust. None of that bothered him. He didn't dive for recognition. He dove to find peace. Miller Lake was both beautiful and haunting. On summer mornings, its surface shone like polished silver under the rising sun. Families picnicked near the shallows, children skipping stones that bounced 3, 4, 5 times before vanishing into gentle ripples. But beneath the calm surface, the water grew darker and colder. Silt rose easily at the slightest touch, swallowing visibility whole. Logs lay twisted like skeletons across the lake bed, and the long weeds clung to passing fins as if wanting to pull divers down toward forgotten secrets. People told stories about the lake. They said that back in the 1980s, an armored truck had vanished somewhere close to Kingston Falls. The crime was infamous enough to make national headlines. 2 guards transporting a large sum of cash from a bank branch, and somewhere along the remote roads between towns, the truck disappeared without a trace. The only theory anyone could form was that one of the guards betrayed his partner and orchestrated the heist, never to be seen again. Suspicions hung in the community for years, but eventually the case went cold, swallowed by time and lack of evidence. Locals still joked that the money sat rusting in a cave, or that the runaway guard lived on a tropical island spending stolen cash. Nobody truly believed any version of the story. It became a ghost tale parents used to add spice to bonfire nights. But Michael had a different sense about the lake. He always felt that it remembered every tragedy. It kept what people lost, whether that was hope or human lives. On the evening when everything would change, he arrived at the lake later than usual. The sun hovered low on the horizon, staining the sky with streaks of orange and lavender. A light breeze picked up, causing tiny waves to lap against the pebbled shore. His respirator tanks clinked as he unloaded them from the back of his truck, the familiar sound grounding him in his ritual. He checked each valve carefully, running his hand along the smooth metal to ensure there was no crack or leak. He tugged the straps of his buoyancy vest, tested the dive light, and fastened the waterproof camera to his gear. Breathing in deeply, he surveyed the lake. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, with a hint of gasoline from jet skis docked farther down. A couple was packing up fishing rods near the pier, speaking in soft tones. A dog barked at the splash of a jumping fish. Everything was ordinary, peaceful. Yet, in Michael's chest, an odd fluttering feeling twisted, as if invisible fingers tapped gently at his ribs, urging him to pay attention. He shrugged off the sensation, chalking it up to anticipation. Today, he planned to explore a section of the lake bed he had avoided in the past, an area further from shore where the ground suddenly sloped downward into a deep basin. It was a place divers said felt like descending into a pit. Every time he'd approached it before, the murkiness and strange cold currents made him turn back, but he had recently upgraded his equipment. Today, he felt confident. He tightened his mask, lowered himself into the water, and began to swim toward the depths. Each kick of his fins left a trail of tiny bubbles that glimmered in the fading daylight. The sounds above grew faint, replaced by the rhythmic rush of his breathing through the regulator. Here, in this quiet, his mind always relaxed. All worries, bills, loneliness, the scars of memory, drifted away with the movement of the water. He reached the deeper zone. The light dwindled quickly as he descended, and he switched on his dive lamp, illuminating swirling particles suspended like dust in air. The metal detector clipped to his belt vibrated lightly, reacting to small scraps scattered across the bottom. He collected a piece of broken pipe, a rusted beer can, and a tangled mass of fishing line. Each item he stuffed into the mesh bag he carried at his hip. Then, as he swept the detector to his right, it gave a sudden sharp signal. A loud, steady beeping that was unlike anything he had encountered in this area. He froze, gently lowering himself to kneel on the silty floor, careful not to disturb the sediment too much. The detector continued to scream in his hand, insistent, urgent. This wasn't a bicycle frame or tossed engine part. This was something enormous. His heart accelerated. The eerie feeling from earlier surged back, now pounding through his veins. Slowly, he aimed his light forward, peering into the murk. But the water was too thick with sediment to see anything more than drifting clouds. He reached out a cautious hand and swept away a layer of silt. His fingers brushed against something solid, something flat and cold. He traced along the surface. It wasn't a stone. It wasn't shaped like trash. It was smooth. Manufactured. Metal. He looked around, trying to map its boundaries. The object extended far to his left, vanishing into the darkness. He moved along its length, running his hand across what felt like a reinforced seam. His lamp caught a faint, indiscernible marking beneath algae and rust. His pulse hammered harder. There was no doubt in his mind now. This wasn't some random dumping ground debris. It was too big, too structured. Michael tried to calm his breathing, realizing the air consumption was rising quickly. His training reminded him to think clearly. He knew he had reached the limit of what he could accomplish in a single dive without preparation. He needed to surface, regroup, and come back with a better plan, if he chose to return at all. A strong instinct told him that he had just touched something the lake had been keeping hidden for a very long time, an ancient secret lying silent under a blanket of mud and memory. Before he could explore further, a current stirred unexpectedly, lifting clouds of silt that swallowed his view. His dive computer chirped a warning that he needed to begin his ascent. Reluctantly, he pushed away from the lake bed and kicked upward, letting the buoyancy carry him toward the dimming twilight above. As he rose, he kept glancing downward at the murky shape disappearing beneath him. Whatever it was, it felt immense, and important, and dangerous. Breaking the surface, he took out his regulator and inhaled the chill evening air. The shoreline lights flickered to life one by one, distant and small compared to the enormity of what lay beneath him. He had come here to remove garbage, to clean away what people discarded and forgot. But today, Miller Lake had offered up something entirely different, something the world had not meant to find again. He floated there for a moment, staring at the stillness of the water disturbed only by the soft ripples around him. Then, without saying a word, he began his slow swim back to shore, already knowing that his life, and the lake's, had just changed forever. Michael spent most of that night lying awake in his small bedroom, staring at the ceiling as silent shadows from the streetlights shifted along the walls. The hum of the refrigerator in the next room and the occasional rustle of wind against the siding were the only sounds accompanying his thoughts. He kept replaying that moment underwater, the metal detector's alarm screaming through the headset, his hand brushing against the impossibly large surface hidden in the darkness. He hadn't seen much, but what he felt through his gloves was enough to haunt him. It wasn't a boat. It wasn't a car. It was something bigger, something important. The rational part of him tried to insist that it could be anything industrial, a large storage container dumped illegally decades ago, or a piece of old equipment from the days when construction crews expanded the lake's dam. But another part of him, the part that sensed stories buried beneath the lake's calm skin, whispered a different possibility. a possibility tied to the old rumor that had echoed around Kingston Falls for years like a ghost refusing to rest. He couldn't ignore the truth that lived in his chest. He needed to go back. When dawn finally arrived, gray and muted across the sky, Michael rose before his alarm sounded. He moved through the familiar motions of brewing coffee, but he barely tasted it. He gathered his gear with hands that trembled, whether from excitement or dread, he couldn't tell. By the time he arrived at the lake, the world was still quiet. Mist drifted low across the water, shrouding the surface in a thin veil like the lake didn't want to reveal what it held beneath. He stood on the shore for a moment, adjusting his wetsuit and tightening each strap with thorough precision. He inhaled deeply, letting the cold air fill his lungs, and tried to shake off the weight sitting heavy on his shoulders. Whatever was down there, he told himself, he had faced darker memories in these waters before. He could face this too. Slipping into the lake, he felt the familiar embrace of the water rise up past his chest, then his shoulders, then close around the back of his neck. With a slow breath through the regulator, he descended again into the silence. The dive light cut through the murk like a narrow blade of white, illuminating swirling clouds of silt. His fins pushed him forward, one deliberate kick at a time. Even though he had swum this area countless times, it looked foreign today. Every shadow seemed deeper, every shape uncertain. He steered towards the slope that dropped abruptly into the deep basin, letting gravity and buoyancy work together to pull him lower. The lake seemed to sense his presence. A hush settled, as though the water itself was listening. He reached the general area where the powerful signal had blasted through his metal detector the night before. His heart pounded harder with every kick, matching the rising anticipation. The detector in his hand beeped weakly at first, then louder with each sweep until it shrieked in that same insistent tone. He turned his body to follow its prompting, and then, there it was again, the cold touch of metal beneath the shifting silt. This time, he didn't shy away. He cleared more sediment with controlled sweeps of his hand and fin, watching as the sheer size of the structure began to take form under his light. A flat expanse disappeared beyond visibility. He glided along its edge and felt the contours of a reinforced railing or armored paneling. His pulse quickened. His fingers brushed against a hinge. With more effort, he wiped away a clump of algae and gasped into his regulator as the unmistakable outline revealed itself. A heavy, fortified door. He moved farther, tracing the shape of a massive wheel locked in place. This was no ordinary vehicle. It was unmistakably designed for protection. A moving fortress meant to shield something valuable. Every detail confirmed it. He had found an armored truck. But why was it here? The question swirled in his mind like stirred silt, clouding every thought. He pushed forward, trying to see more, though the darkness clung stubbornly to the edges of his beam. The truck lay on its side, partially buried, as if the lake had been trying for decades to consume it whole. He considered the depth of the discovery. The town had searched for years, assumed the worst, but never imagined this outcome. The vehicle's presence at the bottom of Miller Lake changed everything. Michael continued his exploration, more cautiously now. His fingers brushed across warped metal and chunks of mud-caked steel that must once have gleamed beneath the morning sun. He found a jagged tear in the side panel that exposed a hollow darkness inside. He resisted the urge to peer in. The interior would have to wait for professionals. Each movement stirred more silt, and soon he could barely see the lights on his own wrist. He pressed on, moving toward what he imagined must be the cab. Visibility dropped even more sharply near the truck's front end. Thick sediment coated everything in sight, only revealing fragments when disturbed. As he reached forward again, his hand collided with something long and rigid, half buried in the mud. The object gave slightly under the pressure, metallic, certainly, but thinner than the truck's body paneling. He cleared a bit of silt, revealing a barrel shape and a rough grip. His lungs tightened. It looked like a gun. Not a rifle, not a casual piece of scrap, but service-grade equipment. Had there been a struggle down here? His mind began connecting dots, slow, unsure, yet compelling. The armored truck had been missing for decades. The story of betrayal, the accusations, the unfound evidence. And now the lake had revealed that the truth had been lying only a few dozen feet from the families and officers who searched endlessly. Something terrible had happened here, and the lake remembered all of it. His dive computer chirped again. Air was running low. He blinked the clouds of silt from his mind and forced himself to back away, to ascend before his curiosity overpowered his reason. Carefully, he kicked upward, the pressure in his ears changing rhythmically as he rose. The cold loosened into a more breathable chill, and soon he saw the gentle shimmer of daylight above. Breaking the surface, he spat out the regulator and inhaled several deep breaths, but this time the air did little to calm him. He swam toward shore, feeling somehow exposed, as if the lake itself had eyes trained on him, reluctant to let him leave with what he now knew. Feet squishing into the shallows, Michael pulled off his mask and wiped water from his eyes. The mist had mostly lifted, revealing the park's picnic tables and benches and the parking lot where only a few cars rested. It was such an ordinary morning for everyone else. Children would come splash in the water soon. Couples might take boats out to the far side of the lake. People would toss breadcrumbs at ducks, feed seagulls, laugh and play. None of them would ever guess a tomb of steel lay just beneath their feet. He stripped off his fins and sat heavily on the damp sand, staring at the water that glistened innocently beneath the sun's early light. His heart raced like it wanted to escape his chest. The enormity of what he had found began to settle not just in his thoughts, but in his gut. A lead weight dragging him down with the realization that this was no longer just his secret. Someone needed to know. Yet, even as that conclusion formed, fear rose beside it. What if the authorities dismissed him? What if they blamed him for disturbing the site? Or worse, what if secrets were kept buried deliberately long ago, and his discovery threatened to awaken dangers he couldn't imagine? He rubbed his face with both hands, the coarse feeling of dried lake water and silt reminding him that delaying wouldn't change anything. Whatever was down there was too large, too significant to ignore. He stood up slowly, muscles stiff from the cold water and tension, and began packing his equipment. All the while, his mind kept returning to that hard metal door under his hand. That unmistakable wheel, that half-hidden gun, and the chilling certainty that the armored truck had not sunk here by accident. By the time he reached his truck, he had made his decision. He would call the sheriff's office. He would show them his underwater footage. He would tell them everything. As he drove away from Miller Lake, he glanced once more through the rearview mirror. The water shimmered under the growing daylight, rippling gently, as if laughing at the idea that its mysteries could ever truly be revealed. It looked calm, harmless. But Michael now knew the truth. The lake was a graveyard of forgotten crimes, and he had just uncovered the first bone. Whatever happened next, the quiet balance he had found in his diving life was over. The lake had given him a story no one could ignore, and the nightmare buried in the depths had only just begun to surface. Michael dialed the sheriff's office from his truck, his fingers trembling slightly as he held the phone to his ear. For a moment, he considered hanging up, pretending none of this was happening, letting the lake keep its secrets. But the memory of the armored truck beneath the water, the cold metal door, the buried gun, pressed against his conscience like a weight too heavy to carry alone. So he waited as the line rang, hoping he was doing the right thing. The deputy on duty sounded unimpressed at first. Reports of strange objects in the lake were not uncommon, usually ending with the retrieval of old appliances or boat parts dumped illegally to avoid disposal fees. But when Michael mentioned the armored door and the unmistakable shape of a large commercial vehicle, the deputy hesitated. Michael offered to show the underwater footage he had captured, shaky but clear enough to reveal the massive structure's presence. After a moment of silence, the deputy told him to stay where he was and wait. They would send someone. Michael paced the shoreline, anxiety and adrenaline warring inside him. The lake glimmered mockingly under the sunlight, its surface giving no indication of the monstrous riddle buried beneath. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the rumble of a patrol SUV approached. Two uniformed officers, Deputy Harris and Officer Leary, stepped out, both wearing skeptical expressions that said they expected to find very little. Michael showed them the video. Their body language changed almost immediately. Harris leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the dark silhouettes and identifiable armored structure. Leary exhaled sharply through her nose, a sign of growing realization. They exchanged a few low but urgent whispers. Harris asked Michael questions about depth, approximate coordinates, visibility, and the condition of the vehicle. Michael answered each as clearly as his racing mind allowed. Without hesitation, Harris radioed the sheriff's office, requesting immediate backup and specialized equipment. Within the hour, more squad cars and unmarked vehicles rolled into the lakeside parking lot. Crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze as officers began blocking off access to the dock. Curious onlookers gathered near the edges, trying to catch snippets of conversation or glimpse something unusual happening across the water. The atmosphere shifted noticeably. This was no longer a casual inquiry. It was an unfolding investigation. Sheriff Calvin Briggs arrived soon after, a stern man in his late 50s with a reputation for being concise and unbothered by pressure. His boots crunched across the gravel as he approached Michael, who repeated every detail once more. Briggs listened intently, nodding just once before addressing the gathered team. Divers were ordered to gear up. A large tow truck with industrial-strength winches was called in. A command tent went up as radio chatter intensified. Michael watched everything unfold with a strange mixture of relief and dread. He was grateful he hadn't imagined the discovery, that someone in authority finally understood what he had stumbled upon. But he also felt like he had awakened something that was better left undisturbed. As the divers prepared their equipment, one of them approached Michael and asked him to guide them to the exact spot. For a brief moment, Michael hesitated. The deep basin, the strange currents, the shroud of silt, it was a place he had always avoided for a reason. Yet, he had already crossed the threshold into this mystery. Turning back was no longer an option. He strapped on his gear once again and joined the dive team in the water. The descent felt different this time, less peaceful, more tense. The divers fanned out behind him as he led them toward the slope. He pointed his beam downward, and the divers followed it until the armored truck's silhouette emerged from the clouds of sediment surrounding it. Even underwater, the divers' reactions were unmistakable. Muted exclamations, a freeze in motion as they absorbed what they were seeing. One of them swam directly to the exposed wheel and brushed away algae, revealing the unmistakable outline of reinforced rims. Another diver examined the front end, gesturing energetically toward the steel framework. Within minutes, the divers secured heavy-duty steel cables around the truck's strongest points. They worked methodically, as if afraid the lake might clutch the vehicle tighter if given the chance. The truck resisted their efforts, stubbornly lodged in the muck, as though it had become a natural part of the underwater landscape during its long captivity. Michael hovered nearby, illuminating their work, his stomach twisting each time the lake bed groaned under shifting weight. When the divers signaled that all cables were attached, the team began their ascent. Michael lingered for a final moment, staring into the murky darkness where the truck rested. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from within the shadows, a presence long trapped, waiting for release. Back on the surface, the tow operator revved the winch to life. The cables tightened, humming under tension. Everyone drew closer, breath held collectively as the machine strained against the truck's immense, waterlogged mass. The winch whined, the gears clacking loudly in protest. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the lake erupted into motion. A great bubble of air burst upward, startling several spectators. The water churned violently as the truck's frame began to shift. Mud and debris belched to the surface, carried upward by trapped gases escaping after decades underground. The truck groaned, metal scraping against rock. Inch by inch, it rose like some slumbering beast pulled unwillingly from its den. As more of the structure emerged into visible light, people gasped. The rust-scarred body was pitted deeply from years underwater, paint stripped away almost entirely. The windows were shattered, black holes staring outward like dead eyes. Water poured from cracks as though the vehicle wept the lake's secrets. Finally, the truck broke free entirely, crashing against the tow platform with a dull, resonant clang. The force of the landing caused one of the side windows to cave inward, and something white toppled out. Gasps became screams. Several onlookers stumbled backward, pressing hands to mouths. Even hardened officers recoiled instinctively. On the ground beside the armored truck lay a human skull. Its jaw hung askew, as if caught in a silent scream that had lasted decades. At that moment, a heavy, suffocating silence took hold. The lake, so loud moments ago with its violent upheaval, fell eerily still. Officers stared at the skull and then at one another, their expressions caught between shock and grim validation. They had suspected tragedy, but now it was undeniable. Michael stood rooted to the spot, cold dread curling through his veins. He had hoped, naively, that maybe no one had been in the truck when it sank, that maybe the truth wouldn't reveal itself in bones. But the lake cared nothing for hope. The recovery team moved into high alert. Evidence markers were placed, photographs taken. The sheriff gave orders swiftly, clearly shaken but determined to remain composed. Michael felt a hand on his shoulder. Deputy Harris, who thanked him quietly, voice brittle with tension. Without Michael, they might never have found this. The truck still had secrets to surrender. The skull was just the beginning. Every person on the scene now understood one chilling fact. This was not just an accident. This was a crime scene sealed shut by water and time, and the moment the lake gave up the truck, the past awoke. The sun dipped lower on the horizon as the investigation deepened, casting long shadows across the armored body. Flashing police lights spun red-blue reflections over the wreckage, creating a surreal spectacle that drew more townspeople to the perimeter. Whispers spread quickly. Is that the missing armored truck? They finally found it? What happened to the guards? Each question sharper than the last. Michael backed away slowly, needing space to breathe. His heart raced, yet his lungs refused to fill properly. He watched as officers pried open the rear doors, struggled against years-rusted bolts resisting the intrusion. He wasn't sure he wanted to see what lay inside, but he also couldn't leave. He had uncovered a truth forgotten for decades. But he sensed this discovery was only the first layer. Beneath the rust, beneath the broken glass, beneath the spilled bones lay a darker secret, waiting patiently to be uncovered. The lake had held its breath for a long time. Now it was time to exhale. The late afternoon sun hung heavy in the sky, its rays filtering through a thin cloud cover as officers and investigators surrounded the armored truck like solemn guardians of a long-buried secret. The skull, lying on the ground beside the vehicle, had shifted the atmosphere entirely. What had begun as a strange discovery now undeniably bore the weight of a homicide investigation. The truck was still dripping lake water, pooling into muddy rivulets that slithered across the pavement, as if the depths of Miller Lake were refusing to release their grip on what was once theirs. Michael found himself unable to step away. His wetsuit still clung to him, cold and damp, sending occasional shivers up his spine, but he was far too absorbed in the scene to notice the discomfort. Officers clipped on fresh gloves, spoke in low and urgent tones, and readied the specialized tools needed to pry the armored doors open. Rusted hinges, swollen from decades beneath the water, had fused shut. The truck had become a prison cell that time itself had locked. One of the investigators, a seasoned crime scene technician named Lowell, approached the rear of the vehicle with a hydraulic spreader. The machinery whirred to life, its jaws biting into the seam between the doors. The metal groaned under the pressure, creaking loudly like a wounded beast refusing to yield. Spectators on the other side of the police line flinched each time the steel screeched. Michael's heart thudded like a hammer against his ribs. He didn't want to see what lay inside, yet he knew he wouldn't be able to look away. The truth was coming, and whatever emerged from that hollow space would follow him for the rest of his life. With a final yank from the spreader, the hinges gave way. The rear doors lurched open, releasing a heavy gust of foul air that struck the investigators full in the face. The stench of decay and stagnant water filled the space around them, a smell that only years of sealed death could brew. Several officers recoiled, covering their noses and turning their faces from the source, while others forced themselves to remain steady. Flashlights snapped on, beams cutting through the dim interior. Michael's breath caught in his throat. Inside the truck, piles of deteriorated cloth lay heaped across the floor. It took a moment for his eyes to recognize them as money bags, hundreds of them, bursting at the seams. Mold and silt clung to the frayed fabric, and stacks of banknotes spilled out in clumps, their once crisp edges fused together into mushy, greenish bricks. Thousands of dollars now rotted into sludge, the promise of wealth transformed into a grotesque reminder of greed and ruin. But the horror didn't end there. In the far corner of the armored compartment, propped awkwardly against the wall, sat a human skeleton. Its bones were weathered but mostly intact, held together by scraps of faded uniform fabric. The skull was missing, undoubtedly the one that had already been discovered outside, but the rest of the remains sat eerily posed, as though waiting for the doors to open for decades. One hand still clutched the rusted grip of a revolver, fingers curled rigidly around the weapon's corroded frame. Someone had died inside this tomb, alone and locked away in freezing darkness. Sheriff Briggs stepped closer, his lips pressed into a thin line as he examined the gruesome scene. The forensic team moved methodically, marking evidence with numbered tents and taking photographs from every angle. Every tiny detail mattered now. A bullet hole in the wall near where the guard's head would have been. A scattering of debris around the bones. Waterlogged straps dangling from hooks where cash bags once hung. Michael watched, transfixed, feeling the world tilt around him. He had guessed that someone might have died when the truck sank, but seeing the truth made his stomach twist painfully. The narrative town gossip had painted of a guard turned criminal mastermind, escaping with stolen riches now crumbled into dust like the money bags themselves. The real story was etched in the bullet hole and the silent scream of bones left behind. Lowell and another technician knelt beside the body, inspecting the weapon. They exchanged a troubled glance. Briggs noticed and approached them. "What is it?" he asked. Lowell studied the revolver again before answering. "This gun hasn't been fired in decades. The chamber's untouched. There's still a full load, no spent cartridges." Michael felt his knees weaken and locked them to steady himself. The implication hit him instantly. If the guard hadn't fired the weapon, then the bullet that shattered his skull had come from someone else. Someone who had been inside the truck with him. Someone who had made sure he wouldn't survive to tell the truth. The idea wrapped itself around Michael's mind like a cold vine. All at once, the folklore of the escaped thief mutated into something far more sinister. A betrayal had unfolded inside these armored walls. A betrayal sealed in by rising water. The techs proceeded deeper into the compartment, careful not to disturb the remains more than necessary. Every new angle of light brought fresh confirmation of the tragedy. Evidence of a struggle. Scuffed flooring, bent bars, a toppled cash cassette suggested that panic and violence had erupted in the limited space before the truck ultimately surrendered to the lake. It wasn't hard to imagine those final moments. The guard trying desperately to fight off his attacker while water began to seep through every weak seam. His pleas drowned by both a gunshot and the lake's suffocating embrace. Michael suddenly remembered the gun-shaped object he had seen half buried in the silt near the cab during his dive. If it was indeed another firearm, then perhaps the killer tried to discard it before the truck sank completely, an attempt to erase part of the evidence already too late to hide. The thought made his skin crawl. Sheriff Briggs called a brief meeting near the tail of the truck. His voice remained low, but every word carried the sharp edge of shock morphing into determination. "We don't speak to the public about details yet. We confirm identities first, we follow procedure, and we treat this like the homicide case it clearly is." He turned toward the remains, then back to the officers. "We owe this man the truth." Michael swallowed hard, his mouth dry as dust. He had wanted justice for the lake and its victims, but confronting the human cost left him feeling overwhelmed. The enormity of what he'd uncovered pressed down on him like the weight of the lake itself. Had he disturbed a grave better left sealed? Or had he given a voice to someone long silenced? Reporters began to cluster beyond the barricades, cameras raised, microphones pointed, voices rising with questions. Michael's name was already being whispered. Some people recognized him as the diver who always cleaned the lake. Now, he was the man who'd exposed a decades-old crime. As the forensics team prepared to remove the remains, Michael stepped farther back, letting the scene blur behind him. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their imaginations fanning flames of speculation. But, as he turned away from the vehicle's open doors, he noticed something odd. In the corner of the truck's cargo area, half submerged beneath a pile of waterlogged bills and shredded sacks, something protruded, a small leather upholstery strap still buckled to the wall. It was positioned oddly, too neat compared to the chaotic mess everywhere else. Michael couldn't shake the suspicion that the guard might have been restrained. If that were true, then the story became even darker. Not just greed and murder, but captivity and terror in the final moments before the truck went under. He closed his eyes, trying to breathe through the overwhelming wave of dread washing over him. Behind the images of bones and bullet holes, another thought tugged at him how close he had come to brushing directly against the remains. How the lake had kept the truth so near, yet so unreachable, suspended just out of sight until now. As the coroner's vehicle rolled up, Michael finally tore his gaze away. He walked a few paces toward the shoreline, needing to separate himself from the grim spectacle. The cool breeze off the lake soothed him slightly, lifting strands of hair against his forehead. But when he looked out at the water, the shimmering surface no longer reminded him of peace. It reminded him of a coffin. Deputy Harris approached him quietly. There was gratitude in the man's eyes, but also something like sorrow. "You did the right thing coming forward," Harris said, his voice sincere but heavy. "If you hadn't found this, no one ever would have." Michael nodded, though uncertainty still knotted in his chest. The truth had been delivered, but it was tainted, covered in mud, sealed by tragedy. And with every revelation, more questions rose to take the place of the ones answered. Who fired the fatal shot? What happened to the second guard? What had pushed someone to betray their partner so brutally? And where was the rest of the story? The part that explained how the armored truck ended up sinking to the bottom of Miller Lake, abandoned by both authorities and conscience? The investigators would dig deeper now, into the evidence, into the past, into memories people wished would stay buried. The lake had surrendered one body, but it might hold more. As the sun dipped behind the pines and evening shadows lengthened across the shore, Michael remained still, haunted by the thought that he had only just begun to uncover the truth. What else had the lake been hiding all these years? And how many ghosts waited in the darkness, longing to rise? Night had settled over Kingston Falls by the time the armored truck was transported to the county impound facility. Floodlights washed over the rusted steel, stretching long shadows across the concrete as officers continued their examination under the watchful gaze of the sheriff. The remains of the guard had been carefully removed from the interior and taken to the coroner's office, but the haunting emptiness left behind did little to relieve the chill that lingered in every observer's chest. The truck was silent now, but its metal seemed to vibrate with the memories of terror and betrayal locked inside it. Michael could have gone home. He could have slipped into the solitude of his house and buried himself under a blanket, pretending that the darkness outside didn't mirror the darkness he had helped raise from the water. Instead, he remained on the fringes of the investigation, unable to pull himself away. Every step he took was guided by a sense of duty he didn't fully understand, as though he had been chosen to be the voice of the lake's dead. Sheriff Briggs approached the truck with a purposeful stride, his jaw set tight. He was a man who had seen his share of violence and sorrow, but even he seemed troubled by what they had uncovered. He ordered his team to begin inspecting the cab of the truck more closely. If the guard in the rear had been executed, The answers as to how and why might be found where the crime began. Crime scene technician Lowell climbed into the driver's side with a flashlight, sweeping the beam slowly across the interior. The seats were stiff from water damage and torn in places where metal had bent inward. Mud coated the floor, and algae clung to the dashboard in gauges like grotesque decorations. Beneath the defiled upholstery lay decades of unanswered questions. Michael stood just outside the taped perimeter, his eyes fixed on the cab. He remembered the object he had found buried in the silt near the truck, something that looked like another gun. He mentioned it to Deputy Harris quietly, describing its shape, location, and how deeply it seemed embedded. Harris nodded and relayed the information to the sheriff, who signaled for the divers to prepare for one more search at dawn. That single clue, lodged halfway between concealment and discovery, felt like a thread that might unravel the entire story. Meanwhile, Lowell continued his inspection and paused when his flashlight beam landed on something wedged beneath the driver's seat. He reached carefully, fingers prying at a rusted metal box stubbornly fused to the floor by time. With a grunt, he freed it and held it up to the light. The box was small, rectangular, and sealed with an old padlock that had corroded almost to dust. Briggs, who had stepped closer, ordered the box to be opened immediately. A quick twist with a tool snapped the weakened lock. As the lid creaked upward, Michael felt his throat tighten, his pulse surging. Inside the box, cushioned within decayed fabric, lay several waterlogged documents, a few faded photographs, a laminated ID card, and a small notebook, its cover warped but still intact. The sheriff's eyes hardened as he recognized the ID. Thomas Blake, he read aloud. Second security guard assigned to the route the day the truck disappeared. The name hung in the air like a ghost suddenly given breath. For more than 30 years, Blake had been the invisible phantom in the case, the man presumed to have vanished with the stolen cash. His absence had been labeled guilt. His silence had been read as confession. But now his belongings were found locked inside the very vehicle everyone believed he had escaped. Lowell carefully lifted the notebook. It was swollen, heavy with absorbed water, and several pages had stuck together in clumps. Briggs ordered the item to be handled with extreme care and sent for a document analyst. The coroner's office, already searching for identifying features on the skeleton, seemed poised to deliver a revelation that would rewrite everything the town thought it knew. Michael watched the scene unfold with a kind of horrified awe. He could almost feel the presence of Blake, the alleged traitor, hovering nearby as though demanding the truth be told at long last. If he had plotted a heist, why would he have left his personal effects behind? Why didn't he leave the truck? Why didn't he flee with the money he supposedly wanted so badly? The thought circled Michael's mind until it crashed into one chilling possibility. Blake had not escaped. He had died in the truck. Morning came with a heavy sky. The divers returned to the murky depths of Miller Lake, guided by Michael's measurements and memories. This time they uncovered exactly what he had described, a pistol buried halfway into the sediment. The metal was degraded, yet it unmistakably matched the service weapon issued to armored security guards during the era of the heist. It was carefully recovered and secured as evidence. Back at the impound, the coroner arrived with preliminary findings that immediately drew every officer's attention. The skeleton from the rear of the truck belonged to Daniel Rhodes, the guard who had long been accused of orchestrating the heist. His badge and uniform fragments confirmed his identity. More significantly, Rhodes had been killed by a bullet fired at close range. His revolver had never been discharged. The narrative that had once villainized Rhodes now stood exposed as a lie. It was Blake, the missing second guard who remained unaccounted for. The notebook was placed inside a glass enclosure in a sealed room where the pages were teased apart and dried with meticulous care. Days passed as analysts deciphered the ink smears and the frantic pen strokes left behind, and when the first legible entries were revealed, the truth emerged like a corpse dragged from the depths. Blake began by detailing ordinary frustrations, long shifts, low pay, and the crushing weight of debt that had mounted from medical bills for an ailing parent. His words grew darker over time, hinting at desperation. He wrote about jealousy, watching others succeed while he struggled to breathe financially. It became clear that he had begun to entertain dangerous thoughts. Greed crept into his heart like a slow poison. His plan, as he described it, was simple and horrifying. He would stage a robbery. He would eliminate Rhodes, who he believed would resist. He would drive the truck to a predetermined location and disappear with the cash into a new life far from Kingston Falls. His tone and early entries suggested confidence. He believed he was smarter than everyone else. Then came the shift. On the day of the heist, Blake wrote in hurried, uneven scrawl. Fear clouded his words. He described how Rhodes had become suspicious, how the confrontation inside the moving truck escalated, how panic sharpened every breath. A struggle ensued in the confined space of the cargo bay. A gunshot thundered inside the armored vault. Rhodes fell. Blake's victory lasted seconds before it collapsed around him. The truck veered off the road, Blake wrestling with the steering wheel while drowning in terror over what he had done. The tires slipped, the ground dissolved beneath the weight of the vehicle, and the lake swallowed the truck whole. The entries grew fragmented, frantic. Blake wrote about the darkness closing in, about pounding on jammed doors that refused to open, about water rising past his ankles, his knees, his chest. He scribbled that the locks had seized, trapping him in the metal coffin with the man he murdered. He wrote of regret. Regret so profound it seemed to choke the ink from the pen. Then the entry stopped abruptly. Every officer who read those pages fell into a stunned silence. The killer had become the victim of his own crime, drowning alongside the man he betrayed, locked together forever in a tomb of his own making. Michael felt a deep, unsteady ache ripple through his chest. There was tragedy in this kind of justice. Poetic, yes, but devastating. 2 men had died terribly in that truck. One guilty, one innocent. The truth had been buried under water, misunderstood by a community that had needed someone to blame. And now, after all these years, the truth had surfaced because he had listened when the lake whispered to him. Sheriff Briggs ordered a final dive, one meant not for crime scene expansion but for closure. The divers recovered a second skeleton wedged beneath the steering wheel. Thomas Blake's remains were brought to land with reverence. Rhodes's name would finally be cleared. Blake's would stand as a warning etched into history. The recovery ended with the truck sealed again, this time to preserve evidence rather than conceal it. Officers began the long process of reconstructing the case for the record, ensuring that the narrative townsfolk passed down would be rewritten with honesty. Michael stood alone at the water's edge when night fell again. The wind carried a biting chill, but he remained still, staring across the calm black surface. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, as if nothing unusual had ever happened there. But he could feel its energy, lighter now, perhaps relieved of one burden among many. He wondered what Rhodes had thought in those last moments: fear, confusion, betrayal. and he wondered what Blake had thought when the water pressed against his lungs for the final time. Did the greed fade? Did he understand too late that he had thrown away everything for a fantasy made of paper and ink? Michael closed his eyes and let the wind brush across his face. He had pulled truth from the depths. Justice, not perfect but real, had been given to a man who had died trying to protect what wasn't his. But even as he felt a small spark of closure, a new fear settled deep in his gut. The discovery of the truck had unleashed more than truth. It had awakened attention. Reporters called non-stop. Crowds gathered near the water daily. The lake he loved was no longer quiet. His world had changed forever. The stillness he had found in the depths was gone, and the next chapter, he sensed, would force him into choices he never wanted to face. Choices not just about justice, but about his own moral compass. The lake had given up its secret. But it wasn't finished with him yet. The town of Kingston Falls changed almost overnight. What had once been a quiet lakeside community, where conversations revolved around fishing forecasts, school events, and local diner gossip, was suddenly the center of statewide attention. Reporters from major networks crowded the narrow streets, their vans parked haphazardly along the curb, satellite dishes angled towards the sky as though trying to pull the story directly from the heavens. Photographers loitered near the sheriff's office, snapping images of any official entering or leaving, hoping to capture the next sliver of information about the armored truck raised from Miller Lake. The tragedy of the two guards, Daniel Rhodes, wrongly vilified for decades, and Thomas Blake, swallowed by his own greed, sent shockwaves through the entire region. News anchors repeated the story with a mixture of fascination and gravitas. Commentators speculated on what had driven Blake to such desperation. Bloggers discussed the psychological unraveling evident in his final diary entries. Social media buzzed constantly with theories, sympathies, and morbid curiosity. People who had never heard of Kingston Falls suddenly treated the town like a crime landmark, a place where buried secrets didn't stay buried forever. Through it all, one name kept surfacing: Michael Johnson. Reporters referred to him as the diver who solved the cold case, the man who uncovered the truth, the lake keeper who gave justice to the dead. Every time Michael turned on the television or checked his phone, he saw headlines pairing his name with the words heroic, lucky, or extraordinary. But none of it felt real. None of it felt good. He had never wanted attention. He had only wanted to keep the lake clean. Yet now, whenever he walked through town, people whispered and pointed. Some approached him with excited smiles, asking for photos or interviews. Others congratulated him, clapping him on the back as if he had single-handedly cracked a mystery that had baffled police for decades. A few resentful voices muttered that he had gotten lucky, that he had stumbled into a fortune at the bottom of the lake. One man, emboldened by drink, even accused him of intentionally hunting for treasure rather than cleaning the water. Michael hated every second of it. The lake had taught him to be humble, to move quietly, to respect the unseen. Now, strangers were turning his discovery into spectacle. Still, none of that compared to the pressure that built once the evaluations of the waterlogged cash began. The rotted money bags recovered from the armored truck held far more than the police initially guessed. Many bills had fused into clumps beyond saving, eaten away by mold and time. But a surprising number had been preserved by the thick canvas of the sacks. Specialists estimated that, after restoration and verification, the remaining money might amount to several $100,000, possibly more, enough to change someone's life. And the law was clear. The company that had originally owned the cash had dissolved decades ago, its assets absorbed into a succession of mergers until the original claim was ambiguous and effectively void. The funds, legally categorized as abandoned property recovered under extraordinary circumstances, qualified for a state-mandated finder's reward. The finder was Michael. He sat in a small conference room inside the sheriff's office as a legal representative from the county explained the details to him. The room smelled faintly of old paper and industrial cleaner, an atmosphere that made the official's words feel even more surreal. "In cases like this," the lawyer explained, sliding a printed document toward him, "the state awards a percentage of the total recovered value to the individual responsible for discovery and reporting. Given your compliance, your assistance in the investigation, and the uniqueness of the situation, you qualify for the maximum allowable benefit." Michael stared at the number printed on the page. He blinked once, twice. The words blurred slightly, like ink melting into water. Even after all deductions and restorations, the figure was staggering. The lawyer continued speaking, outlining next steps, necessary signatures, waiting periods, all the administrative details that made the process seem normal, though nothing about this was normal. Michael felt as though the walls were bending, closing in on him. He had expected something, perhaps, but not this. Not such a large sum. Not something that could erase every financial worry he had ever known. Once the meeting ended, Michael walked out of the sheriff's office in a daze. The afternoon sun warmed his skin, yet he felt cold. He walked home slowly, choosing side streets to avoid the clusters of reporters. Each step felt heavy, anchored by the knowledge that he was now holding a burden disguised as opportunity. At night, alone in his home, he sat at the small kitchen table and stared at the printed paperwork. The number glowed back at him, bold and domineering. He ran a hand over his face and inhaled shakily. Money like this could fix everything in his life. It could repair the roof, allow him to buy new diving equipment, pay for things he'd put off for years. It could let him quit his job and devote himself entirely to lake preservation. It could give him comfort he hadn't allowed himself to imagine. But every time he began to think of what the money could give, his mind snapped back to the image of two skeletons trapped in the armored truck. He saw Rhodes wrongly condemned by the world. He saw Blake drowning in his own sins. He saw dollar bills floating in the water like rotten leaves. He saw greed dripping from every surface of that submerged tomb. The money in those bags had destroyed lives. It had driven one man to murder and another to decades of slander. It had cursed the lake, turning it into a grave for men who deserved truth more than anyone ever bothered to give them. The thought of accepting even a fraction of that money made Michael's stomach twist. He didn't sleep that night. He sat at the table until dawn, listening to the creaks of the house as though it too whispered advice. When light seeped through the window, he made coffee he didn't drink. He gazed outside at the lake, barely visible between the trees, and felt an ache deep in his ribs. He had always believed the lake protected him, or perhaps judged him. It had taken someone he loved when he was young, but it had also given him a purpose. Now it had given him a choice. As days passed, the town's curiosity grew. People speculated openly about what he would do with the money. Some insisted he deserved it. Others claimed he'd be a fool not to take it. A few, speaking in hushed but bitter tones, hinted that someone like him, a loner, a diver, a man with no family, shouldn't be entrusted with so much. The pressure mounted. He received letters from strangers asking for help. invitations to speak on television, offers from opportunists pretending to care about lake conservation while their eyes shimmered with greed. But the only voices he cared about were two he could never hear: Rhodes and Blake. Rhodes, who had died faithful to his duty and been posthumously betrayed by falsehoods. Blake, who had died suffocating in his own guilt, clawing at steel walls that would not let him escape. Michael could not take their blood money and build a better life on it. He felt that truth deep in his bones. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines and painted the water in crimson streaks, he took his old kayak out onto the lake, the place where he had felt most at peace before all of this. He paddled to the center where the water was calmest and drifted. The stillness enveloped him like a familiar embrace. He whispered softly, words he didn't fully understand until they left his mouth. "I won't become like him." The lake responded with a gentle ripple as though approving. 2 days later, he walked back into the county office, documents in hand. The legal representative looked up from her desk with formal anticipation. Michael took a deep breath and said the words that had carved themselves into his heart. "I'm declining the funds." The silence that followed felt immense. The lawyer blinked as if she hadn't heard correctly. She asked him to repeat himself. He did, slowly, clearly, and with conviction. He explained that he wanted the full share redirected toward public benefit: lake restoration, youth programs, environmental education, memorial efforts for the victims. The lawyer tried to remind him of what he was giving up, but Michael only shook his head. "It isn't mine," he said quietly, "and it never will be." As he signed the declination, his hand trembled, not from fear, but from relief. A weight lifted, one he hadn't realized was crushing him until it was gone. When he stepped outside, the air felt lighter than it had in weeks. Yet he also knew that this decision would change the town's perception of him even more. Some would call him noble, others foolish. Many would never understand. But he hadn't done it for them. He had done it for the lake, for the dead it had held, and for the man he needed to remain. His conscience was clean. But the story wasn't finished yet. There was still a future to build, a future where the lake could become a place of healing rather than tragedy. A future where children could learn to respect the water instead of fearing its depths. And a future where Michael Johnson would discover that sometimes the hardest choices forge the strongest beginnings. The lake had taken much from him over the years. For the first time, he had given something back. The choice Michael made sent ripples throughout Kingston Falls far stronger than any that moved across the lake's surface. News of his decision spread almost as quickly as the story of the armored truck itself. Some called him a hero of uncommon integrity. Others whispered that he was insane, that no regular person would turn down such a fortune, especially someone who lived as humbly as he did. Neighbors who barely acknowledged him before now watched him with baffled curiosity, unsure whether to admire him or assume something was wrong with him. Yet Michael felt strangely calm. In the quiet that followed his announcement, he rediscovered a part of himself that had gone missing, buried somewhere beneath the shock and attention of the past weeks. He remembered why he had started diving in the first place. It was never for glory, never for wealth. It was for the lake, for the lives that touched its waters, and for the beliefs he carried deep enough to drown in. He stood on the shoreline one early morning, watching a new crew arrive. Trucks unloaded equipment, skimmers, dredging devices, trash collecting drums, and biodegradable containment barriers. The county, supported by the redirected funds, had approved a large-scale lake restoration initiative. Michael observed with a quiet satisfaction as professionals spread across the site, preparing to clean the water with the kind of resources he could never have dreamed of affording alone. He joined them not as a leader, not as a symbol, but as a worker. Mask over his eyes, tank strapped tight, fins in hand. The other volunteers greeted him with respect and a hint of awe, but he brushed off the attention. The lake did not care for applause, and neither did he. As he submerged once more into the cool depths, the distress and noise of recent weeks slipped away. He kicked steadily through deep green currents, helping guide floating trash nets, untangling debris snarled in reeds, and pointing out submerged hazards to divers with less experience. The water felt lighter now, cleaner, as though the lake itself was breathing again. Above the surface, life in the town began to shift. The sheriff held a small ceremony near the lakefront to honor Daniel Rhodes. His family, once shamed and avoided, returned to Kingston Falls to receive a formal apology. Tears flowed freely when Rhodes's sister placed a bouquet near a memorial stone carved beside the water. Children who had grown up hearing that Rhodes betrayed the town now learned the truth. He was a victim of loyalty, not greed. Blake's relatives received closure as well, though mixed with agony, knowing his wrongful choices had dragged both men into the depths. Still, truth offered them a chance to grieve with clarity rather than unanswered questions. With every improvement made to the lake, with every educational program drafted in Rhodes's name, the narrative that had once been steeped in darkness slowly transformed into one rooted in healing. Months passed, and the seasons turned. The heat of summer softened into the crisp chill of autumn. Trees lining the lake shed their amber leaves into the water, where children raced to scoop them out before they drifted away. A wooden boardwalk was built along one edge of the lake, with rails engraved with messages about conservation and the importance of preserving natural spaces. Michael walked along it occasionally, smiling at the sight of families enjoying the place without sensing the weight it once carried. The youth diving club became a reality, populated by eager teenagers and younger children who had never felt comfortable near the water until now. They looked to Michael as a mentor, a guide, sometimes even a hero, although he gently corrected them each time. "The lake is the hero," he always said. "I just listened to it." But inside, something more complicated stirred. He was proud of his choice, proud of what it had built, proud of the fact that tragedy had not been the final chapter in this story. And yet, on quiet nights, memories still crept up like chill currents. The sight of bones falling from a broken window. The eerie shape of the armored truck rising from darkness. Blake's final words etched in panic. Rhodes's lonely, undeserved death. Those images did not simply fade, they became a part of him, embedded in his identity like his scars. The lake did not let him forget. It reminded him constantly that beauty and horror could share the same water, and that redemption often swam side by side with guilt. One weekend, Michael found himself surrounded by children gathered for their first official dive training session. He demonstrated how to adjust a regulator, how to equalize pressure, how to move through water without disturbing the lake bed. The kids giggled when bubbles tickled their faces. Their enthusiasm spread warmth through him, a warmth he had not felt since before the armored truck changed everything. When several brave students dipped beneath the surface, Michael guided them gently, ensuring no one strayed too far or panicked beneath the unfamiliar silence. He hovered near the bottom and let his light sweep across sand and stones. Some sections of the lake bed looked scarred still, faint depressions where the truck once lay, but aquatic grass had begun to grow through the disturbed silt. Nature was reclaiming what destruction had stolen. The students resurfaced laughing, triumphant after even the smallest dive. Michael floated beside them, soaking in their joy as though it were sunlight. He realized then that he was no longer a man haunted by what he found, but a man shaped by what he chose afterward. Later that evening, as the children packed up and parents waved thanks across the pier, Michael remained by the water. The lake reflected the golden glow of dusk, turning ripples into shimmering threads of light. He padded towards the edge and let the water wet his toes, breathing deeply as he welcomed the chill. The wind rustled reeds nearby, making a soft, ancient sound that felt almost like a language. In that moment, Michael sensed something he had never quite felt before. Not the guilt of the past or the burden of responsibility, but a quiet harmony. The lake no longer seemed wounded. It no longer whispered in suffering. It breathed, calm and balanced. He had made the right decision. A moment later, he knelt and placed his palm upon the water's surface. The coolness embraced him gently, like an old friend. He thought about Tyrone, his childhood friend who had been lost long before the guards, before the truck, before this new future. He wondered if Tyrone would have been proud of him. He hoped so, even if the pride wasn't necessary. The lake had taken Tyrone, but in return it had given Michael a calling, a purpose, a life dedicated to making sure what happened back then would never happen again. Not because he wished to erase pain, but because he had learned what survived after grief could become something good. Honoring that was enough. The lake stretched endlessly before him, shimmering under the fading sun. Tomorrow he would dive again, gather more volunteers, teach more children, and continue to do the work that anchored his heart. Nothing about this lake was perfect, but that was why it mattered. Imperfection was what made it real. Imperfection was what made redemption possible. As he stood, droplets sliding from his hand back into the water they belonged to, he took one final look across the lake. A calm certainty settled within him. The story of greed, betrayal, and tragedy was over. In its place flowed a new narrative of forgiveness, education, and hope. One where the memory of those who died ensured the safety of those who lived. The lake would always hold its secrets. But now it also held a promise. Michael walked away slowly, each step light and steady. Behind him, the water rippled in gentle waves, as if waving goodbye, or perhaps saying thank you. The lake had given up its darkest truth, and in doing so, it allowed the future to shine brighter than ever. If you were shocked by what we discovered in the depths of Miller Lake, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next unbelievable story. Check out our other videos for more hidden mysteries and incredible discoveries that will leave you speechless. And don't forget to share this video, tell your friends where you're watching from, and see who else can handle the secrets we reveal.